Believe in yourself is one of the great catchphrases of our age. Whether it's from athletes, influencers, or film stars, our social media feeds are full of encouragements to believe in ourselves. But Jesus once told a story to a group of people who did just that. And his message was very different. Don't believe in yourself. Jesus' stories are some of the most famous and well-loved ever told. And this film is part of a series in which I'm looking at some of my favourites. I'm David Ingall, founder of Burning Heart, and we're all about using film to explore the Bible and bring it to life. And Jesus' stories or parables are a filmmaker's dream. They're visual and engaging in a way that speaks to our hearts and imaginations. And Jesus was a master storyteller, using the stuff of everyday life, the home and family, the marketplace and shopping, or farming and the natural world. And there are weddings and family feuds and everything in between. Jesus uses things everyone can understand and relate to. And then through them, he not only tells us a good story, but also teaches us something about God or us, or both, God's kingdom. And yet I think we can miss some of the force of Jesus' parables. Some are too familiar, and so we miss the bite and punch of the story. The ways in which Jesus uses them not just to teach, but to challenge and provoke and get us thinking and doing. And others we know, but we miss some of the colour and detail because we don't really know the world that Jesus is describing. And so we can do with some help bringing them to life in fresh and deeper ways, which is what this little series is all about. Using film to do that and then digging into what they mean for us. Jesus told a famous story about a Pharisee and a tax collector who went up to the temple in Jerusalem to pray. But for all its fame, it's an easy story to misunderstand. Not least because its setting and characters are no longer familiar to us. The temple was destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago. The Pharisees were a group of religious leaders and scholars who no longer exist. And while we do still have tax collectors, they're completely different from their ancient equivalents. So it's a story that can do with updating. And I'd like to tell you the story of the pastor and the criminal. The location and characters are different, but the other words are Jesus's from Luke 18. Two men went into a church to pray, one a pastor and the other a criminal. The pastor, standing by himself, was praying, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this criminal. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income." But the criminal, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. You probably noticed that I put myself in the middle of the parable, and not as the hero, but the villain, the pastor, or in the original, the Pharisee. And one reason for doing that is to bring out some of the challenges in the story. Lots of us assume the point is to encourage and welcome in the criminals, tax collectors and wrongdoers of this world, all those who feel on the edge or not good enough. And as we'll see, there is a powerful message of grace and inclusion for them. But the main group of people that Jesus wants to talk to are not actually the sinners and tax collectors, but the Pharisees and pastors and people like them. Which means that this parable is not primarily an encouragement at all, but a challenge. We need to put ourselves in the middle of it and ask if that challenge is one that we need to hear. Luke tells us that Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. And it quickly becomes clear who that is, the Pharisee or pastor and those like him. The question is, what's he doing wrong? And Luke's opening not only shows us who Jesus' audience were, it also highlights their problems. And the first is self-confidence. Believing in yourself, where we started this film, and the positive advice of countless social media posts and stories. These people trusted or believed in themselves. And that self-confidence comes out strongly in the story. The pastor or Pharisee doesn't ask God for anything, but just lists his qualities and achievements, and clearly assumes that's enough. He succeeded in life. But Jesus obviously disagrees and zooms in on the Pharisees' self-focus as a key problem. The passage finishes, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted." The Pharisee's mistake is he's made this all about me. He's the star of the show, trusting in his own abilities and righteousness, and looking to promote and exalt himself. And there is probably an element of performance in this. What Jesus criticizes elsewhere, people praying to be seen by others. Unlike in our dramatization, the temple would have been packed and crowded, and many scholars think the prayer would have been out loud, with everyone able to hear and admire the Pharisees' piety. And they would probably have been very impressed. We tend to see the Pharisees very differently from Jesus' original audience. Because Jesus often clashed with them, they come across pretty badly in the Gospels, as here. And so we see them almost as cartoon cut-out villains. But that wasn't how they were seen at the time. They were a religious group marked out by various beliefs and a commitment to God's law and holy living, among the main spiritual leaders in the community. The closest modern equivalent probably is a priest or pastor, as in our dramatization, but their reputation was actually far higher. Church leaders these days are in a bit of a popularity slump after numerous scandals and mistakes, whereas Pharisees were widely respected and admired, famous for living lives that not only did all God required in the law, but also went further. As this man demonstrates, he boasts of his good works, tithing everything he receives and not just what was required in the law, and fasting twice a week, again going above and beyond. What a man! Or at least that's what his hearers would probably have thought, and certainly what he did. But not Jesus. Because the problem with all that is that he'd made it all about himself when it should have been all about God. The tax collector, or criminal in our dramatization, for all his faults, gets it right. He shows us where our focus should be, on God. He really prays, he cries out for mercy, he relies on God, and that is why he's the hero of the story. And at that point, I want to ask you a question. Who are you relying on in your life? because I think this is a big one for us and our culture. As we've seen, we're told to believe in ourselves, to chase our dreams and look within for what we need to make it happen. But what Jesus says here really jars with all that. For me, it feels like that's a real challenge in the context of my work and ministry. Okay, you rolling? Jesus tells me here to humble and not try and exalt myself. And yet that so often feels part of the job. I make and present films about the Bible, I'm on camera. And then publicising them and social media and tracking views and likes are unavoidable if anyone's ever going to watch them. And yet all that sounds uncomfortably like trying to exalt myself. And I'm going to guess that there are bits of your life where this bites and hits home too. At work, on social media, even in church. So what are we supposed to do? Does this mean we should have low self-esteem and not try and achieve anything? No. You are made in the image of God, precious and loved so much that Jesus died to save you. That's not the stuff of low self-esteem. And as for achievements and making a difference in life, well, elsewhere, Jesus tells us that if we are in him, you will bear much fruit. You will make a difference. And backing yourself at work or as an athlete or creative can often be part of that. So what does this mean? It's all about where we place our focus and trust. I love the old saying, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Jesus is calling us here to reorientate our lives and focus around God, humbling ourselves and relying on him like the tax collector does. This unusual looking ornament is called an armillary sphere, designed to map out our solar system. The problem with this one though is that it has the Earth at the centre, not the sun. Before the 16th century, everyone thought that we were the centre of the universe, until a Polish astronomer called Nicolaus Copernicus realised that actually we revolve around the sun. And I think we need a similar mind shift, a Copernican revolution in how we live our lives. To stop putting ourselves at the centre of everything and instead reorientate everything around God. That may not actually look that different on the outside. I talked earlier about the dangers for me of self-publicity in our filmmaking and marketing. And yet I do believe God has called me to this, and that we should be looking to share what we're doing. The key is I need to make sure that my trust and focus is on Jesus, and not on me or how successful or not our films are. What does this look like for you? What does it look like for you to humble yourself as Jesus tells us to at the end of this passage? That final challenge is quite broad, but there is a particular focus in the passage on righteousness and our standing with God. Luke describes the people Jesus is speaking to as trusting or believing in themselves, but then adds that they were righteous. And Jesus' words and story then challenge and undermine our understanding of what righteousness means. Most of his listeners would have assumed it was all about morality and ethics and religion, living a good life, and that if you did that, then you'd be right with God. But Jesus then tells this story in which one character, the Pharisee or pastor, does do all that, but isn't right with God, and the other character, the tax collector or criminal, does none of that, but is right with God. We've already seen how Pharisees were famous for being good and righteous and following God's ways, and the audience are probably expecting him to be the hero. By contrast, tax collectors were about as bad as you can imagine. They were collaborators, working with the hated Roman regime to oppress and extort their own people. Worse, they then add an extra bit on top of the required taxes and skim it off for themselves, cheating and stealing from the people, and then using Roman soldiers to enforce it all and make sure they got their money. So when the tax collector in the story describes himself as a sinner, he's right. He was a sinner. And no one in Jesus' original audience would have had any time for him at all. Even a criminal today, as in our update of the parable, is a more sympathetic and positive character. And yet, he's the one who goes home justified before God, and not the Pharisee or pastor. Jesus clearly and explicitly breaks the link between goodness and being right with God. The point is not that the tax collector is better than we think, or that God has seen hidden potential in him, or hidden flaws in the Pharisee. No, the good man is not justified, while the bad man is. You can't earn your way into God's kingdom. Even if you're the very best, it's not good enough. Part of the issue with the Pharisee or pastor is that his focus is on other people, and he thinks that he's better than most. He says, I'm not like others, I'm not like this tax collector. But they're not the standard. God is, and he's not like him either. We may not be as dismissive of others as the Pharisee was, but we can easily think we're okay because we assume that the standard is the world and people that we see around us. But it's not. It's God. Which would lead us to despair if it wasn't for the second half of the message. Even if you're the very worst, you can still be made right with God by humbling yourself as demonstrated by the tax collector and throwing yourself on God's mercy and grace. He presumes nothing. He knows he has no right to anything. He just asks for mercy, and God gives it. The word he uses isn't the usual Greek word for mercy, but one associated with sacrifice and the temple, hilaskomai. It literally means make atonement. The tax collector is not just asking God to forget about all his sins and wrongdoing, or be a bit more lenient than he could be. He's asking God to deal with and make restitution for all that he's done wrong. And there's a cost and price to that. A cost and price that Jesus pays and bears at the cross, even if that's still not completely clear to Jesus' original audience here. It's the cross that makes it all possible, changing this parable from a travesty of justice into a wonderful message of grace and inclusion to everyone. And that everyone includes you, whichever group you're in, because this is for tax collectors, criminals and sinners, but also for Pharisees and pastors. And Jesus told this story to them, to us, as a challenge, yes, but a challenge so that we too can be saved. I wonder if Jesus set the original parable in the temple deliberately to remind the Pharisees of the daily sacrifices there for the people's sins. Even under the Old Covenant, it was always clear that we could never be good enough for God and needed sacrifices and forgiveness to be right with him. And I think Jesus wanted them to remember that and then trust and believe in him, who is both God and the ultimate sacrifice, and not in themselves. And I think God wants you to remember that too. The biggest reason why I cast myself as the Pharisee in this story is because I realized how easily I can be like him. I look at all my good works. I'm a pastor and preacher. I make films about the Bible. I read it and pray every day. My whole life revolves around God. But you know what? None of that is why God loves me and why he welcomes me in. It's all good, but not the reason. And I need to remember that. And what about you? Can I gently ask you to put yourself in this parable too? And remember that all the good things you do, all the God things you do, the Bible reading, the prayer, the worship, the kindness, the charity, all the good works, it's all great. But none of it is why God welcomes you in. Don't believe in yourself. If you're right with God, it's not because you're good, but because you too can pray, God, have mercy on me, a sinner.